Some moments don't look important when they happen. They pass quietly, almost unnoticed, like a small pause in a room full of noise. But every now and then, a single moment carries a weight no one else can see yet. A moment that doesn't end when it's over, but instead begins something far bigger beneath the surface. This story starts with one of those moments, not with a confrontation, not with a dramatic scene, just a simple gesture, and the absence of it. In a world where power is measured in influence, status, and perception, respect is often given automatically, until, suddenly, it isn't. And when it's denied in front of everyone, it doesn't just test confidence. It reveals something deeper. Something about people, about systems, about how quickly silence can become more powerful than words. But what happens when the person who was underestimated doesn't react the way everyone expects? What happens when silence isn't weakness, but strategy? When patience isn't hesitation, but preparation? Because while everyone else moves on, believing the moment has passed, something else is already in motion. Quiet, calculated, invisible. This isn't just a story about revenge, it's about timing, about control, about seeing what others miss and using it when it matters most. Stay with this story till the end. Because what happens next won't just change everything for them, it will change the way you see power itself. The room was designed to impress before a single word was spoken, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting the skyline like a mirror of power, every surface polished to a quiet shine that whispered money, control, and influence. Conversations floated in low, confident tones, the kind that only exist where decisions shape industries and fortunes change with a signature. Every handshake in that room carried weight, an unspoken exchange of recognition, of status, of belonging. It was a ritual as much as it was a gesture, brief, simple, yet loaded with meaning. Accepting it meant acknowledgement. Refusing it meant something far louder than words. Eyes turned, not all at once but in fragments, as presence shifted the air ever so slightly. There was anticipation in those glances, curiosity sharpened by the awareness that something unusual was unfolding. A moment that should have passed unnoticed began to stretch, growing heavier with each second. The hand extended wasn't just a greeting, it carried effort, years of quiet work, resilience shaped in silence, and the expectation, however small, that respect would meet it halfway. Instead, there was a pause. Not long, but long enough to be felt. Long enough for the room to register it. A flicker of dismissal crossed the space where acknowledgement should have been. The kind of dismissal that doesn't need words because it thrives on their absence. The hand remained, suspended between intent and rejection, before slowly retreating, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. In that instant, the noise of the room seemed to dull, like everything else had stepped back to make space for the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't loud, no one raised their voice, no scene was created. But the silence carried a sharper edge than any confrontation could have. A few exchanged glances quickly masked, others pretended not to notice, returning to their conversations with practiced ease. Yet the shift was undeniable, like a crack beneath a flawless surface. Respect had been denied, not privately, but in a room built on the illusion that everyone there had earned their place. What lingered wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't even anger, not in the way most would expect. It was clarity, the kind that settles in quietly, reshaping everything in an instant. Because moments like that don't just reveal how others see you, they reveal exactly where they stand, and more importantly, where they believe you belong. The refusal to shake a hand is never just about the hand. It is a quiet decision made in full view, a deliberate break from a universal gesture that has, for centuries, symbolized trust, equality, and mutual respect. In professional spaces, especially those built on hierarchy and perception, a handshake is more than etiquette. It is a signal. It tells everyone watching who is acknowledged, who is accepted, and who is deliberately kept at a distance. In that moment, the refusal becomes a statement louder than any spoken insult. There are no harsh words, no direct confrontation, yet the message lands with precision. It says, "You are not worth this gesture. You are not on my level. You do not belong in this circle I control." And because it is done without explanation, it leaves no room for immediate response, trapping the other person in a silence that feels both public and isolating. What makes it more powerful is its simplicity. A handshake takes only a second, requires no effort, and costs nothing. Which is exactly why refusing it feels so intentional. It strips away any excuse of oversight or distraction and replaces it with clarity. This was chosen. Every person in the room understands that, even if they pretend not to. They recognize the break in social code, the subtle violation of an unspoken rule that governs professional interactions. The impact extends beyond the two individuals involved. It reshapes the atmosphere of the entire room. Observers begin to recalibrate their own behavior, consciously or not. Some distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the one who was dismissed. Others watch more closely, sensing a shift in power dynamics. A single denied handshake can redraw invisible lines, creating separation where there should have been connection. For the one on the receiving end, the moment carries a complex weight. It isn't just rejection, it is exposure. It places them under a spotlight they never asked for, forcing them to process the insult while maintaining composure. Any reaction risks reinforcing the very perception being imposed on them, so the response becomes controlled, internal, precise. Not because the moment lacks impact, but because it demands restraint, and in that restraint something changes. The refusal, meant to diminish, instead reveals. It exposes arrogance, insecurity, and the need to assert dominance in the smallest of ways. It turns a simple gesture into a defining moment, not just of disrespect but of understanding. An unmistakable signal of how power is perceived, wielded, and eventually challenged. Power imbalance rarely announces itself outright. It settles into a space so naturally that most people stop questioning it. In high-level corporate environments, it is woven into everything: the seating arrangements, the tone of conversations, the way attention shifts towards certain voices while others struggle to be heard. It becomes an invisible structure, quietly dictating who is respected without question and who must prove their worth just to be acknowledged. In such a setting, the gap between an outsider and a corporate giant is not just about position or wealth, but about perception, access, and control. The outsider enters that world carrying none of its built-in advantages. There are no long-standing relationships to rely on, no reputation that precedes them into the room, no assumptions working in their favor. Every step forward requires effort, every word is measured more carefully, and every action is observed through a lens of skepticism. While others operate with the ease of belonging, the outsider moves with awareness, understanding that even a small misstep can reinforce the narrative that they do not belong there. On the other side stands the corporate giant, backed by years of dominance, influence, and a network that reinforces its authority. Confidence in this case is not just personal, it is institutional. It comes from knowing that decisions ripple outward, affecting markets, industries, and livelihoods. This kind of power often creates a sense of insulation, where accountability feels distant and challenges seem unlikely. The environment adapts to them, rather than the other way around. What makes this imbalance particularly striking is how it shapes behavior. The one with power can afford to be dismissive, to overlook, to act without immediate consequence. Their actions are often rationalized or ignored, protected by their status. Meanwhile, the outsider must navigate carefully, aware that they are being evaluated not just for competence but for legitimacy. The same action can be interpreted entirely differently depending on who performs it, yet within this imbalance lies a hidden vulnerability. Power that goes unquestioned often becomes overconfident, and overconfidence creates blind spots. The assumption that an outsider poses no real threat can lead to underestimating them entirely. It turns attention elsewhere, leaving gaps where none should exist. And while the imbalance appears to favor one side completely, it also sets the stage for something unexpected, because the one with less visible power often learns to operate in ways the other never sees coming. The instinct to react is immediate, almost automatic. When faced with disrespect, especially in a public setting, the body responds before the mind has time to fully process. Pulse quickens, thoughts sharpen, and the urge to correct the moment rises fast and unfiltered. It demands expression, a response that matches the weight of the insult, something that restores balance in real time. But choosing silence in that exact moment is not weakness, it is control in its most disciplined form. Observation begins where reaction is withheld. Instead of interrupting the flow of the moment, attention shifts outward, taking in details that would otherwise be lost in the noise of emotion. The way people look away, the ones who linger just a second longer, the subtle shift in posture from those who recognize what just happened but choose not to engage. Every small reaction becomes information, every glance a clue. The room reveals itself more honestly when it believes nothing is being challenged. Silence also disrupts expectation. Most anticipate some form of response: defensiveness, confrontation, even visible discomfort. When none of that comes, it creates a different kind of tension, one that lingers beneath the surface. It forces others to sit with what they witnessed rather than dismiss it as a brief exchange. The absence of reaction becomes its own presence, controlled and deliberate, suggesting that something is unfolding beyond what is immediately visible. In that stillness, emotion doesn't disappear, it refines itself. Anger becomes focus, embarrassment becomes clarity, and the initial sting transforms into something more precise. Without the distraction of outward expression, the mind begins to organize, to connect, to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. Patterns emerge of behavior, of hierarchy, of unspoken rules that govern the space. What might have been a fleeting moment instead becomes a point of analysis. This kind of restraint creates distance, and in that distance, perspective sharpens. The situation is no longer just personal, it becomes structural, strategic. It shifts from a moment to be endured into one that can be used. Because reacting satisfies the present, but observing prepares for what comes next. And preparation, built quietly and without drawing attention, has a way of turning a single moment of disrespect into the foundation for something far more calculated, something that moves not with impulse, but with intent. Being underestimated is rarely accidental. It is often the result of assumptions formed in seconds and solidified without evidence. A hidden identity, or even just an unrecognized background, becomes the perfect canvas for those assumptions to take shape. People see what they expect to see. Titles, appearances, introductions, and when something doesn't fit their predefined image of importance, they quietly reduce its value. What they fail to realize is that what remains unseen is often far more significant than what is immediately visible. A person without a widely known name or an obvious display of influence moves through spaces differently. There is less scrutiny at first, fewer barriers raised in anticipation of threat. Conversations happen more freely around them, details slip out without the usual caution, and the environment reveals itself without realizing it is being observed. This lack of recognition, while seemingly a disadvantage, becomes a form of access that others with established reputations no longer have. It allows proximity without resistance, presence without pressure. At the same time, the internal experience is far from passive. There is an awareness of being misjudged, of having capabilities overlooked or dismissed entirely. Every interaction carries a subtle tension, the knowledge that others are engaging with a version of you that is incomplete, simplified, or entirely incorrect. Instead of correcting that perception immediately, it is allowed to exist, not out of acceptance but out of purpose. Because once people settle into their assumptions, they stop questioning them. This creates a unique strategic position. When expectations are low, actions that would otherwise draw suspicion go unnoticed. When influence is not anticipated, its presence is not actively guarded against. The gap between perception and reality widens quietly, and within that gap lies opportunity. It becomes possible to understand systems from the inside without triggering their defenses, to identify weaknesses without being seen as someone capable of exploiting them. There is also a psychological layer to this dynamic. Those who underestimate often become more confident in their judgment, reinforcing their own blind spots. They rely on surface-level evaluations, trusting them as accurate, which makes them less attentive to subtle shifts or anomalies. This overconfidence becomes a vulnerability in itself, one that is difficult to detect because it feels like certainty. What appears to be a lack of identity is, in truth, a controlled absence of visibility. And within that absence, there is freedom, the freedom to observe, to learn, and to move without being fully understood, all while holding an advantage that no one else in the room realizes exists. Disrespect in a professional setting carries a different kind of weight because it is rarely expressed openly. It hides behind subtle gestures, controlled tones, and carefully chosen omissions, making its impact both immediate and lingering. When it happens in front of others, the emotional response becomes layered. It is not just about what occurred, but about who witnessed it, how it was interpreted, and what it silently communicates about one's place in that environment. The first reaction is often internal, a sharp and unexpected shift that disrupts composure. There is a moment where everything feels slightly off balance, where the mind tries to reconcile the situation with the expectation of professionalism and mutual respect. That contrast creates a tension that is difficult to ignore. In spaces where reputation and perception matter, being treated as less than equal doesn't just affect confidence. it challenges identity within that context. There is also the awareness of being observed. Even if no one says anything, the presence of others amplifies the experience. It introduces a sense of exposure, where the moment feels larger than it actually is because it exists not just between two people, but within a collective environment. The mind begins to anticipate how it might be perceived, whether others saw it as a minor interaction or as something more significant. This uncertainty adds another layer to the emotional impact, making it harder to process in real time. What follows is a controlled response, not because the feeling is small, but because the setting demands restraint. Professional spaces often reward composure, even in moments that feel anything but composed. So the reaction is redirected inward, becoming quieter but more focused. Thoughts begin to organize around the experience, replaying the moment, analyzing the intent behind it, and considering its implications. It becomes less about the immediate feeling and more about understanding what it represents. There is also a shift in awareness. Disrespect has a way of sharpening perception, making details stand out more clearly. Interactions that might have seemed neutral before now carry different meaning. Patterns begin to emerge: who aligns with whom, who holds influence, who remains silent. The environment is no longer just a setting, it becomes something to read, something to interpret. Over time, the emotional impact transforms. What starts as discomfort or frustration evolves into clarity. It defines boundaries, not just in how one expects to be treated, but in how one chooses to respond moving forward. Because moments like that do not simply pass, they settle, shaping perspective, influencing decisions, and quietly fueling a determination that is far more controlled than any immediate reaction could ever be. Choosing patience over impulsive retaliation is not a passive act. It is a deliberate shift from emotion to strategy. In moments of provocation, especially when the disrespect is public and unmistakable, the natural instinct is to respond immediately, to reclaim dignity, to correct the imbalance, to make it clear that the moment will not go unanswered. But immediate reactions, no matter how justified they feel, often operate within the limits of the present. They address the surface, not the structure beneath it. Patience changes the scale of response. It allows time for emotion to settle into something more precise, something that can be directed rather than simply expressed. Instead of releasing frustration in a way that might offer temporary relief, the focus turns toward understanding the broader landscape. What initially appears as a single act of disrespect begins to connect with patterns of behavior, of hierarchy, of vulnerabilities that are not immediately visible in the heat of the moment. There is a discipline required to hold back when every instinct pushes forward. It involves resisting the urge to prove something instantly, and accepting that real impact often requires delay. This delay is not empty, it is active, filled with observation, planning, and quiet movement. Each piece of information gathered, each interaction revisited, adds depth to the understanding of how the system operates and where it can be influenced. Strategic patience also creates unpredictability. When no immediate retaliation follows, it disrupts expectation. The one who initiated the slight may assume the moment has passed, that it held no lasting consequence. This assumption lowers defenses, reduces vigilance, and allows routines to continue unchanged. Over time, this false sense of security becomes a critical advantage, opening paths that would otherwise remain guarded. At the same time, patience reshapes internal perspective. It moves the focus away from personal validation and toward calculated outcome. The goal is no longer to respond in kind, but to respond effectively. This requires clarity, knowing not just that a line was crossed, but understanding what response would truly alter the balance rather than momentarily challenge it. What emerges from this approach is not hesitation, but control. A sense that the timing, method, and impact of any action are chosen rather than triggered. And in that control lies a different kind of strength, one that does not rely on immediate visibility but builds quietly, aligning every step toward a result that carries far more weight than any reaction made in the moment could achieve. Timing is often the difference between an action that is noticed and one that is decisive. In situations driven by emotion, there is a strong pull to act immediately, to match the intensity of the moment with an equally immediate response. But immediate action operates in a space where variables are still shifting, where information is incomplete, and where the environment remains alert. Acting too soon can reduce impact, not because the intent is weak, but because the conditions are not yet aligned. understanding timing requires a shift from reacting to reading. It involves observing patterns, identifying rhythms in behavior, and recognizing when attention is high and when it begins to fade. In high-stakes environments, there are moments when everything is closely monitored, after a public incident, during major decisions, or when scrutiny is at its peak. Acting within those moments often leads to resistance, as systems are already in a defensive state. Waiting allows that vigilance to relax, creating space where actions can move more freely and with less interference. Timing is also connected to accumulation. A single moment, no matter how sharp, is rarely enough to create a lasting shift. But when that moment is allowed to connect with others, when information is gathered, when small pieces fall into place, it builds into something more substantial. Acting at the right time means acting when those pieces have formed a complete picture, when the response is not just a reaction but a culmination. There is also an element of psychological timing. People adjust their expectations based on what they experience. If no immediate response follows an incident, they begin to believe that none is coming. This belief lowers their awareness, making them less attentive to changes that might otherwise stand out. Over time, this creates a window where actions can occur without triggering immediate suspicion. The effectiveness of the response is not just in what is done, but in when it is done, when it is least expected and therefore most disruptive. Patience and timing work together to transform intention into impact. Acting too early risks being dismissed or contained, while acting too late can reduce relevance. The precise moment lies somewhere in between, where preparation meets opportunity. Recognizing that moment requires awareness, restraint, and the ability to see beyond the urgency of emotion. When timing is right, the effect extends far beyond the action itself. It lands with clarity, without needing repetition or reinforcement. It reshapes perception in an instant, not because it is loud, but because it arrives exactly when the environment is least prepared to absorb it. Behind-the-scenes intelligence gathering rarely looks dramatic from the outside, but it is one of the most defining phases of any calculated response. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, with a shift in attention. Instead of focusing on the surface of events, the focus moves deeper, into processes, relationships, routines, and the subtle mechanics that keep everything running. What appears stable and untouchable at a distance often reveals complexity, and within that complexity, there are patterns waiting to be understood. The process is built on observation first. Conversations are not just heard but analyzed for what they imply beyond their words. Small details, timing of decisions, recurring names, repeated behaviors, start to form connections. Information that seems insignificant on its own begins to carry meaning when placed alongside other pieces. It is less about any single discovery, and more about how those discoveries align to create a clearer picture of how the system actually functions. Access plays a critical role, but it does not always come from direct entry. Often, it comes from proximity, being present in the right spaces, listening without drawing attention, allowing others to speak freely under the assumption that there is no reason to filter themselves. People tend to reveal more when they feel unobserved or when they underestimate who is listening. This creates opportunities to gather insights that are not formally documented but are just as valuable, sometimes even more so. There is also a method to what is pursued. Not all information holds equal weight, and part of the process involves identifying what matters. Financial structures, decision-making hierarchies, dependencies between departments, and points where pressure accumulates. These become areas of focus. Understanding where influence is concentrated and where vulnerabilities might exist requires patience and precision, because acting on incomplete or incorrect information can undermine everything that follows. As information accumulates, it transitions from raw data into strategy. Patterns become predictable, and predictability creates openings. When you understand how something moves, you begin to see where it can be slowed, redirected, or disrupted. This is where intelligence gathering shifts from passive observation to active preparation, where every detail serves a purpose beyond awareness. What makes this phase powerful is its invisibility. There are no outward signs of what is being built, no indication that anything is changing. From the outside, everything appears normal, unchanged, secure. But beneath that surface, clarity is forming, and with it, the ability to act not just with intent but with accuracy. Financial systems are often perceived as the strongest part of any large organization, built with layers of security, oversight, and precision that give the impression of complete control. They are designed to track, protect, and allocate resources with accuracy, creating a structure that appears both reliable and untouchable. But beneath that surface of stability lies complexity. And within complexity, there are always points where pressure can build or weaknesses can form. These vulnerabilities are rarely obvious, and they do not exist as single points of failure. Instead, they are woven into processes, dependencies, and assumptions that have gone unchallenged for too long. Every financial system depends on movement, transactions flowing through networks, approvals passing through multiple levels, data being recorded, verified, and acted upon. The more extensive the system, the more interconnected it becomes, and with that interconnectedness comes reliance. Departments depend on one another, automated processes rely on accurate inputs, and decision-makers trust that the information presented to them reflects reality. When any part of that chain is disrupted, even slightly, the effect does not remain isolated. It spreads, often quietly at first. Then, with increasing impact, one of the most critical vulnerabilities lies in trust itself. Systems are built with the assumption that those operating within them are following established protocols, that data is entered correctly, and that access is used responsibly. While there are safeguards in place, no system can function efficiently if it treats every action as a potential threat. This balance between security and usability creates gaps, moments where verification is limited, where automation proceeds without deeper questioning, where oversight becomes routine rather than active. Another layer of vulnerability comes from repetition. Processes that are performed consistently over time begin to feel predictable and safe. People grow accustomed to them, less likely to question anomalies that fall within an acceptable range. Small irregularities can pass unnoticed, especially if they do not immediately disrupt outcomes. Over time, this normalization can allow larger issues to take shape without triggering immediate concern. Technology, while powerful, introduces its own risks. Automated systems can amplify errors, executing instructions at a scale and speed that manual processes cannot match. If a flaw exists, whether in code, configuration, or input, it can propagate rapidly, affecting multiple areas before it is detected. The very efficiency that makes these systems valuable also makes them sensitive to disruption. What appears secure is often secure only within expected conditions. When those conditions are altered, even subtly, the system can respond in ways that were never anticipated, revealing weaknesses not because it was poorly built, but because it was never tested in that particular way. Arrogance within a corporate structure rarely presents itself as outright recklessness. It is more subtle, often disguised as confidence built over years of success. When an organization consistently dominates its space, makes profitable decisions, and faces little meaningful resistance, it begins to internalize a sense of certainty. That certainty gradually shifts into assumption, the belief that what has worked before will continue to work, that existing systems are sufficient, and that challenges, if they arise, will be manageable within familiar frameworks. This mindset creates a dangerous kind of comfort. Processes are no longer questioned with the same intensity, and decisions rely more on precedent than on critical evaluation. What was once careful analysis becomes routine approval. The organization starts to trust its own momentum, believing that its scale and experience act as safeguards against failure. In this environment, small warning signs often go unnoticed or are dismissed as insignificant because they do not align with the larger narrative of stability and control. Blind spots form not because information is unavailable, but because attention is selectively applied. When leadership is confident in its position, it naturally focuses on areas that reinforce that confidence: growth metrics, expansion opportunities, visible successes. Meanwhile, less visible aspects such as internal vulnerabilities, overlooked inefficiencies, or emerging risks receive less scrutiny. These areas do not demand immediate attention, so they are allowed to persist without deeper examination. Arrogance also affects how external inputs are treated. Feedback from those perceived as lower in hierarchy or outside the established circle of influence is often undervalued or ignored entirely. This limits the range of perspectives that reach decision-makers, narrowing their understanding of potential risks. When diverse viewpoints are filtered out, the organization loses its ability to see itself clearly from multiple angles. increasing the likelihood that critical issues will remain hidden until they escalate. Another layer of vulnerability comes from predictability. An organization that operates with high confidence tends to follow consistent patterns, both in decision-making and in behavior. While this creates efficiency, it also makes the system easier to anticipate. When actions become routine, they can be studied, understood, and eventually navigated in ways the organization does not expect. The most significant risk is not the presence of arrogance itself, but the environment it creates. One where questioning is reduced, vigilance is softened, and the possibility of being challenged is underestimated. In such an environment, the organization remains strong on the surface, yet increasingly exposed beneath it, not because it lacks capability, but because it no longer feels the need to look for what it might be missing. An overnight collapse is never truly born in a single night. It is the visible result of pressures that have been building quietly, often undetected, until they reach a point where they can no longer remain contained. From the outside, it appears sudden: numbers shift, systems fail, value disappears. But beneath that surface, there has already been a long process of alignment, where conditions have slowly moved toward a breaking point. What makes it feel instantaneous is the speed at which the final stage unfolds. Once the right moment is reached, the response is executed with precision, targeting areas that are deeply interconnected. Financial structures, operational dependencies, and internal processes are all linked in ways that allow disruption to travel quickly. When one critical element is affected, it does not stay isolated, it triggers reactions across multiple layers, each one amplifying the next. This chain reaction creates the illusion of something vanishing all at once, when in reality it is the system reacting to a carefully introduced imbalance. Timing plays a crucial role in this kind of collapse. It often occurs when oversight is at its lowest, outside of regular hours, between reporting cycles, or during periods when attention is naturally reduced. In these windows, responses are slower, verification takes longer, and initial warning signs may go unnoticed. By the time the disruption is recognized, it has already spread far enough to make containment difficult. The delay between cause and detection becomes a powerful factor, allowing the impact to deepen before any corrective action can begin. There is also a psychological dimension to the suddenness. Organizations are structured around the assumption of continuity, the belief that tomorrow will resemble today with only incremental changes. When that expectation is broken in a dramatic way, it creates confusion as much as it creates loss. Decision-makers are forced to process not only what has happened, but how it could have happened without earlier detection. This moment of uncertainty can slow response times further, as clarity is replaced with urgency and fragmented information. The scale of the collapse amplifies its effect. When the numbers involved are significant, the impact extends beyond the organization itself, affecting stakeholders, partners, and perceptions in the wider environment. What was once seen as stable becomes questionable, and trust begins to erode alongside the measurable losses. What appears as an overnight disappearance is, in reality, the final expression of a system pushed beyond its limits, where preparation, timing, and interconnected vulnerabilities converge into a single decisive outcome. Using legal, ethical, or strategic loopholes is less about breaking systems and more about understanding them at a level where their boundaries become visible. Every structure, no matter how well designed, operates within rules. And those rules are created with assumptions about how they will be used. Loopholes exist in the space between intention and execution, where what is technically allowed does not always align with what was originally anticipated. Finding those spaces requires patience, precision, and a deep awareness of how systems interpret actions rather than how they were meant to function. Legal frameworks, for instance, are built to regulate behavior, but they must remain flexible enough to apply across a wide range of situations. That flexibility creates openings. Certain actions may comply with the exact wording of a rule while still producing outcomes that challenge its purpose. Navigating this requires careful interpretation, where each step is measured against what is permitted rather than what is expected. It is not about crossing a line, but about walking directly along its edge without stepping over. Ethical loopholes are more subtle. They operate in areas where actions cannot easily be defined as right or wrong, only as acceptable or questionable depending on perspective. Organizations often rely on internal codes and cultural norms to guide behavior, but these are not always enforced with the same consistency as formal rules. This creates situations where decisions can be justified within the system, even if they create discomfort or raise concerns. Acting within this space requires an understanding of how far those boundaries can be stretched without triggering resistance. Strategic loopholes, on the other hand, are rooted in patterns and expectations. Systems are designed to handle predictable behavior, and over time, they become optimized for those patterns. When something operates outside of that predictability, while still remaining within the rules, it can move through the system in ways that were never accounted for. This is where careful planning becomes critical, because the effectiveness of such an approach depends on aligning actions with both the visible structure and the unseen assumptions behind it. What makes loopholes powerful is their legitimacy. Because they exist within the framework rather than outside it, they are harder to challenge immediately. Responses require interpretation, review, and often time, which allows the initial action to take effect before any countermeasure is fully formed. This delay becomes part of the advantage, creating space where impact can unfold without immediate interruption. Understanding and using these gaps is not about chaos, it is about precision. It transforms rules from barriers into pathways, revealing that even the most controlled systems carry within them the possibility of being navigated in ways no one originally planned. No operation of significant scale is ever truly carried out alone, even when it appears that way from the outside. The presence of allies or unseen partners often exists beneath the surface, not always visible, not always acknowledged, yet essential in ways that are difficult to replicate individually. These are not always formal alliances or openly declared collaborations. More often, they are quiet alignments of interest, individuals positioned in different parts of a system who, knowingly or unknowingly, contribute to a larger outcome. The strength of such partnerships lies in their subtlety. Each person involved holds only a piece of the larger picture, a limited perspective shaped by their role, their access, and their understanding. This fragmentation creates a structure where no single point carries the entire weight of the plan, reducing the risk of exposure while increasing the reach of what can be accomplished. Information flows in controlled directions, actions are distributed across different layers, and the overall movement remains difficult to trace back to a single source. Trust within these connections is not always built on personal relationships. Often, it is built on alignment. Shared objectives, mutual benefit, or even parallel grievances can create a foundation strong enough to support coordinated action. In some cases, individuals may not even be aware that they are part of something larger. Their decisions, made for their own reasons, intersect with others in ways that contribute to a broader outcome. This kind of indirect collaboration adds another layer of complexity, making the structure more resilient and less predictable. Unseen partners also expand capability. Access to different areas, systems, or types of information becomes possible when multiple perspectives are involved. What one person cannot reach, another might interact with daily. This distribution of access allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the environment, turning isolated insights into a connected map of how everything fits together. It is not just about having more resources, but about having the right ones positioned in the right places. There is also a protective aspect to this dynamic. When actions are spread across multiple contributors, accountability becomes diffused. It is harder to identify a central point of origin, harder to isolate intent, and more difficult to respond with precision. This creates a form of structural ambiguity, where outcomes are visible, but the path that led to them remains obscured. What appears as a singular act is often the result of many quiet movements aligning at the right moment, each one small on its own, but together forming something far more coordinated than anyone on the outside can immediately perceive. Public image is carefully constructed, shaped through controlled messaging, curated appearances, and consistent narratives that reinforce strength, stability, and success. It is designed to be clear, confident, and reassuring, offering a version of reality that stakeholders, partners, and the broader audience can trust. Every detail is managed, from how achievements are presented to how challenges are framed, creating an external identity that feels cohesive and reliable. Over time, this image becomes more than just perception, it becomes expectation. Internally, however, the structure that supports this image is far more complex. It is made up of processes, people, and systems that do not always align as seamlessly as the external narrative suggests. There are pressures that build beneath the surface, deadlines, internal disagreements, resource limitations, and decisions made under uncertainty. These elements are part of any functioning organization, but they are rarely visible outside. The contrast between what is shown and what is experienced internally begins to widen, not because the image is false, but because it is incomplete. This gap creates a form of fragility that is easy to overlook. When an organization invests heavily in maintaining its external image, it can begin to prioritize perception over introspection. Issues that do not immediately threaten the outward narrative may be delayed, minimized, or handled in ways that prevent them from becoming visible. Over time, this can lead to unresolved problems accumulating quietly, hidden behind the consistency of the public facade. What makes this contrast significant is how it influences response. As long as the public image remains intact, there is a tendency to believe that the underlying structure is equally strong. This belief can delay recognition of internal weaknesses, especially if those weaknesses do not produce immediate visible consequences. The organization continues to operate under the assumption that its external stability reflects internal resilience, even when that connection is no longer fully accurate. When pressure is applied in the right place, this contrast becomes more apparent. Areas that have been overlooked or underaddressed begin to respond in ways that do not match the polished image presented to the outside world. The system, which once appeared seamless, reveals points of strain, inconsistencies, and gaps that were previously hidden. The difference between appearance and reality does not always matter, until it does. And when it does, the impact is often amplified, not just because of what is happening internally, but because it directly challenges the credibility of everything that was believed externally. A sudden financial shock rarely stays contained within balance sheets. It moves outward, affecting perception, behavior, and decision-making almost immediately. When a significant loss occurs without warning, the initial reaction is confusion, not clarity. Numbers that were once stable shift in ways that don't align with expectations, and the first challenge becomes understanding whether what is being seen is accurate. This uncertainty creates a pause, a brief but critical moment where normal processes slow down as people attempt to verify what has changed. As confirmation begins to take shape, that pause is replaced by urgency. Financial loss at scale is not just about the amount itself, but about what it represents: risk, exposure, and the possibility that something deeper has gone wrong. This realization triggers a rapid shift in priorities. Attention is redirected, resources are pulled toward containment, and decisions that would normally take time are made under pressure. The organization moves from a state of controlled operation to one of reactive management, where the focus is no longer on growth or stability, but on limiting further impact. The shockwave extends beyond internal teams. Stakeholders, partners, and observers respond to the change based on the information available to them, which is often incomplete in the early stages. Speculation begins to fill the gaps, sometimes amplifying the perceived scale of the issue. Confidence, which is built over time, can begin to erode quickly when faced with sudden uncertainty. Even those not directly affected may adjust their behavior, becoming more cautious, more distant, or more demanding in their interactions. Internally, the effect is layered. Different parts of the organization experience the impact in different ways, depending on their role and level of access to information. Some focus on technical resolution, trying to identify the source and correct it. Others deal with communication, managing how the situation is presented and understood. Leadership faces the challenge of making decisions without having a complete picture, balancing the need for action with the risk of acting on incomplete data. What makes the shockwave particularly powerful is its speed. There is little time to adapt gradually. The shift is immediate, forcing responses to happen in parallel rather than sequence. Systems that were designed for steady operation are suddenly required to handle instability, and not all of them are equally prepared for that change. The initial impact may come from a single event, but the effects ripple outward, influencing everything from internal confidence to external perception, creating a chain of reactions that continues to evolve long after the first moment of disruption has passed. When a massive, unexplained financial loss surfaces, the media does not simply report it. It amplifies it, dissects it, and transforms it into a narrative that evolves by the hour. The moment the information becomes public, it shifts from an internal crisis to a global spectacle, where every detail is examined, every possibility explored, and every silence interpreted. What began as numbers on a balance sheet quickly becomes a story of power, failure, and uncertainty, told across multiple platforms simultaneously. the first wave of coverage is driven by urgency. Headlines focus on the scale of the loss, the shock value, and the immediate implications. The lack of clear answers only intensifies interest, creating a vacuum that journalists and analysts attempt to fill with early interpretations. These initial reports are often cautious but speculative, framing the situation as developing, incomplete, and potentially far more complex than it appears. This stage sets the tone, shaping how the public begins to understand the event. As more outlets pick up the story, the narrative expands. Different perspectives emerge. Financial experts analyze the numbers, industry insiders provide context, and commentators begin to question how such a loss could occur without warning. Each layer adds depth, but also introduces variation, sometimes leading to conflicting interpretations. The story becomes less about a single event and more about a web of possibilities, each one competing for credibility. The pressure on the organization intensifies as the coverage grows. Every statement, or lack of one, becomes part of the story. Delays in communication can be interpreted as avoidance, while incomplete explanations can raise further questions. The media cycle demands constant updates, even when verified information is limited. This creates a dynamic where the organization is not only managing the crisis itself, but also managing how that crisis is being portrayed in real time. Public reaction feeds into this cycle. As audiences engage with the story, their responses, concern, speculation, criticism, become part of the broader narrative. Social platforms accelerate this process, spreading information rapidly and often without full verification. What might have remained a contained issue in another era now becomes a widespread conversation, influencing perception far beyond those directly involved. The frenzy is not just about reporting facts, it is about constructing meaning. It turns a financial disruption into a defining moment, one that can reshape reputations, alter trust, and leave a lasting imprint on how the organization is viewed long after the immediate details have been resolved. Inside the boardroom, control is expected to be absolute. It is a space designed for clarity, for measured decisions, for discussions that move with structure and intent. Every participant enters with a defined role, an understanding of hierarchy, and the assumption that even in difficult situations, order will be maintained. But when a sudden, unexplained crisis enters that space, it disrupts more than just the agenda. It unsettles the very foundation of how decisions are made. The first signs of panic are subtle. A shift in tone, a question repeated more than once, a pause that lingers slightly longer than usual. Information begins to arrive in fragments, incomplete and sometimes inconsistent. What should form a clear picture instead creates confusion, forcing those present to piece together meaning in real time. The usual confidence that guides discussion starts to fracture as certainty gives way to doubt. As the situation becomes clearer, urgency replaces composure. Voices that were once measured begin to overlap, priorities clash, and the focus narrows rapidly toward immediate containment. Decisions that would typically undergo layers of review are pushed forward with limited validation, not because the process is ignored, but because time no longer allows for it. The pressure to act outweighs the comfort of certainty, and that imbalance creates tension in every exchange. Hierarchy, which normally provides structure, can become a source of friction. Leaders are expected to have answers, yet in a moment like this, they are working with the same incomplete information as everyone else. This challenges the perception of control, making authority feel less stable. At the same time, those lower in the hierarchy may hesitate to speak openly, even if they hold critical insights, unsure of how their input will be received in an environment already strained. The environment itself begins to change. What was once a controlled space becomes reactive, driven by the need to respond rather than the ability to plan. Each new piece of information has the potential to shift direction, forcing constant recalibration. Strategies form and dissolve within minutes, replaced by alternatives that may or may not hold under pressure. What defines this moment is not just the crisis itself, but how quickly the illusion of control can erode. The boardroom, built to project stability and authority, becomes a place where uncertainty is fully exposed, where decisions carry immediate consequences, and where the gap between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Ego-driven leadership often begins with results. Success reinforces confidence, and over time that confidence can shift into something more rigid, something less open to challenge. Decisions that once relied on careful input and diverse perspectives start to narrow, shaped increasingly by a single viewpoint that has grown accustomed to being right. The transition is gradual, almost unnoticeable at first, because the outcomes continue to justify the approach, until they don't. Within this kind of leadership, perception becomes tightly controlled. Strength is projected consistently, not just to competitors or the public, but internally as well. Admitting uncertainty or acknowledging limitations begins to feel like weakness, something to be avoided rather than addressed. This creates an environment where disagreement is subtly discouraged, not always through direct suppression, but through tone, reaction, and the unspoken understanding that alignment is safer than opposition. Over time, this dynamic reshapes the flow of information. Critical feedback becomes filtered, softened, or withheld entirely. Those who might challenge decisions begin to step back, either out of caution or resignation, leaving fewer voices willing to question the direction being taken. What remains is a feedback loop that reinforces existing beliefs, strengthening confidence while reducing awareness of potential risks. The consequences of this become most visible under pressure. When a crisis emerges, the same traits that once appeared decisive can become limiting: a reluctance to adapt, an insistence on maintaining control, or a delay in accepting the scale of a problem can slow response at the exact moment speed and flexibility are needed. Decisions may be made quickly, but without the depth of perspective required to fully understand their impact. There is also a disconnect that begins to form between leadership and the broader organization. While the leader operates with certainty, others may see inconsistencies, vulnerabilities, or warning signs that are not being addressed. This gap creates tension, reducing trust internally, even as authority is maintained externally. The structure remains intact, but its alignment weakens. The downfall of ego-driven leadership is rarely caused by a single mistake. It is the result of accumulated blind spots, missed signals, and unchallenged assumptions that build over time. When those elements finally converge, the strength that once defined the leadership becomes its limitation, revealing that control without awareness is far more fragile than it appears. Revenge that avoids direct confrontation operates in a completely different dimension from the kind most people expect. There is no raised voice, no visible clash, no moment where two sides stand face to face and acknowledge what is happening. Instead, everything unfolds at a distance, often unnoticed until the effects begin to surface. This absence of confrontation is not accidental, it is intentional, designed to remove emotion from the execution and replace it with precision without direct interaction. The focus shifts away from the individual and toward the system surrounding them. Rather than targeting a person in a way that invites immediate defense, the approach moves through structures, processes, and dependencies that support their position. This creates a layer of separation, making it difficult to trace cause and effect in real time. What is happening does not look like retaliation, it looks like disruption, misalignment, or even coincidence. One of the most powerful aspects of this approach is ambiguity. When there is no obvious source, responses become slower and less certain. People search for explanations within the system itself, assuming that the issue originates from internal failure rather than external intent. This misdirection delays recognition, allowing the impact to deepen before anyone fully understands what they are dealing with. By the time patterns begin to emerge, the initial advantage has already been established. There is also a psychological shift that comes with the absence of confrontation. In a direct conflict, both sides are aware of each other, preparing, reacting, and adjusting in real time. Without that awareness, one side continues to operate under normal assumptions, unaware that anything has changed. This creates an imbalance where one is actively shaping outcomes while the other remains reactive, trying to interpret events as they unfold. Executing revenge in this way requires restraint and clarity. It demands a focus on outcome rather than expression, on impact rather than recognition. There is no immediate satisfaction in being seen or acknowledged. Instead, the result speaks on its own, often without revealing its origin. This makes the effect more enduring because it is not tied to a single moment of conflict, but to a series of changes that unfold over time. What emerges is a form of control that is quiet but decisive, where the absence of confrontation does not weaken the action, but strengthens it by removing predictability and replacing it with calculated intent. The idea of psychological satisfaction in revenge often feels clear at the beginning. There is a belief that restoring balance, proving a point, or correcting a perceived injustice will bring a sense of closure. The mind frames it as a resolution, a way to quiet the tension created by the original act of disrespect. In that early stage, the outcome appears simple: action leads to relief, and relief leads to peace. But as the process unfolds, that clarity begins to shift into something more complex. Satisfaction, when it comes, is rarely as immediate or complete as imagined. There may be a moment, a brief recognition that the imbalance has been addressed, that the response has landed, but it is often quieter than expected. It does not carry the intensity of the original emotion. Instead, it settles in gradually, more like a release of pressure than a surge of triumph. The anticipation that built over time cannot be fully matched by the reality of the result, creating a subtle gap between expectation and experience. Alongside that satisfaction, there is often an unexpected layer of reflection. The process of planning, waiting, and executing requires focus and discipline, and once it is complete, that focus no longer has a direction. The mind, which was once occupied with strategy and outcome, begins to turn inward. Questions emerge, not necessarily of regret but of meaning. Was the outcome worth the time, the energy, the transformation required to reach it? Did it resolve the original feeling or simply replace it with something else? Moral conflict does not always appear as guilt, it can exist as ambiguity. Operating within gray areas, making calculated decisions that affect others, or stepping outside one's usual boundaries can leave a lingering sense of unease. Even if the actions were justified internally, they may still challenge previously held beliefs about identity and values. This creates a tension between what was done and how one sees themselves afterward. There is also a shift in perspective. Once the objective is achieved, the person who carried out the response is no longer in the same position as before. They have moved from reacting to shaping outcomes, from being affected to influencing. That shift can be empowering, but it also changes how future situations are approached. In the end, the psychological experience is not defined by a single emotion, but by a blend of resolution, reflection, and quiet complexity that lingers beyond the moment itself. The impact of a major disruption rarely stops with the individuals directly involved. It spreads outward, touching employees and stakeholders in ways that are both immediate and long-lasting. Within an organization, employees are often the first to feel the shift, even before full details are available. Changes in tone, urgency in communication, and sudden deviations from routine signal that something is wrong. This uncertainty creates an atmosphere where speculation begins to fill the gaps, and without clear information, assumptions can quickly take hold. For employees, the experience is deeply personal. Stability in the workplace is tied not only to income but to identity, routine, and a sense of direction. When that stability is threatened, even indirectly, it creates anxiety that extends beyond the professional environment. Questions about job security, future opportunities, and leadership decisions begin to surface. Productivity can be affected, not because of a lack of capability, but because focus is divided between responsibilities and concern about what might come next. Stakeholders experience the ripple effect differently, but with equal intensity. Their connection to the organization is often based on trust in leadership, in systems, and in the consistency of outcomes. A sudden disruption challenges that trust, forcing them to reassess their position. Investors may become cautious, partners may reconsider commitments, and clients may begin to look for alternatives. Each of these reactions, while rational on an individual level, contributes to a broader shift that can amplify the original issue. Communication plays a critical role in shaping these reactions, but it is also one of the most difficult elements to manage in such moments. Too little information increases uncertainty, while incomplete or inconsistent messaging can lead to confusion or skepticism. Leadership must balance transparency with accuracy, often under conditions where the full picture is still evolving. The way information is shared can influence not just understanding but confidence. What makes the ripple effect significant is its persistence. Even after the initial issue is addressed, its influence can remain in subtle ways. Altered perceptions reduce trust and heighten sensitivity to future changes. Employees may become more cautious, stakeholders more critical, and the overall environment more reactive. The original disruption may have been contained, but its impact continues to move through the system, shaping behavior and decisions long after the first moment has passed. Subtle clues planted before a major event are rarely recognized for what they are in the moment. They exist quietly within normal activity, blending into routine in a way that makes them easy to overlook. At the time, they may appear insignificant, small inconsistencies, minor deviations or details that do not fully align but are not severe enough to demand attention. Because they do not disrupt immediate outcomes, they are often dismissed or rationalized, absorbed into the background of daily operations. The effectiveness of these clues lies in their timing and placement. They are introduced gradually, spaced in a way that prevents them from forming an obvious pattern too early. Each one on its own feels isolated, disconnected from anything larger. It is only when they are viewed collectively, often after the fact, that their true significance becomes clear. By then, they are no longer clues but indicators of something that has already taken shape. There is also a psychological element to how these signals are perceived. People tend to prioritize information that confirms their expectations, especially in environments where stability is assumed. When something slightly unusual appears, the instinct is to interpret it within the framework of normal operations, rather than as a potential warning. This tendency allows early signs to pass without deeper investigation, particularly if they do not immediately affect performance or outcomes. Subtlety also reduces resistance. Obvious changes invite scrutiny, questions, and verification. Subtle ones move more freely, slipping through processes that are designed to catch larger, more visible disruptions. They do not trigger alarms because they do not appear threatening. Instead, they adjust the environment incrementally, creating conditions that can later support a larger shift. As these clues accumulate, they begin to shape the system in quiet ways. Small adjustments to timing, access, or behavior can influence how processes interact, how information flows, and how decisions are made. None of these changes stand out on their own, but together they create a structure that is slightly different from what it once was. This altered state becomes the foundation for what follows. When the final event occurs, it often feels sudden and unexpected, yet traces of it were present all along. The clues were not hidden, they were simply not recognized. Their purpose was never to reveal the outcome in advance, but to prepare the environment for it, ensuring that when the moment arrived, everything was already aligned in a way that made the impact both effective and difficult to anticipate. The transformation from victim to orchestrator does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds gradually, shaped by experience, perception, and choice. At the beginning, the position is defined by reaction. Events happen, decisions are made by others, and the individual is left to absorb the impact. There is a sense of limitation in that role, a feeling that control exists elsewhere, held by those with more authority, influence, or recognition. The focus is on enduring, understanding, and trying to make sense of circumstances that seem unfair or unbalanced. What begins to shift this dynamic is awareness. Instead of viewing events as isolated incidents, patterns start to emerge. Behavior becomes predictable, structures reveal their tendencies, and the system that once felt overwhelming begins to make sense. This shift in perspective is subtle but powerful, because it replaces uncertainty with insight. The individual is no longer just experiencing outcomes, they are beginning to understand how those outcomes are created. With that understanding comes a change in approach. Reaction gives way to intention. Rather than responding to situations as they arise, there is a growing ability to anticipate them, to see where decisions will lead before they fully unfold. This anticipation creates space for choice, and within that space, control begins to take shape. It is not immediate or absolute, but it is enough to influence direction rather than simply follow it. There is also a psychological shift involved. The identity of being affected by circumstances starts to loosen, replaced by a more active sense of agency. Confidence grows, not from external validation, but from the ability to navigate complexity with increasing precision. What once felt unpredictable becomes something that can be studied, understood, and eventually guided. As this transformation continues, actions become more deliberate. Each step is connected to a broader objective, each decision aligned with a long-term outcome. The individual begins to operate within the system rather than at its mercy, using its structures, patterns, and limitations as tools rather than obstacles. This does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how they are approached. By the time the shift is complete, the difference is not just in position, but in perspective. The same environment that once imposed limits now offers possibilities, not because it has changed, but because the way it is understood and engaged with has fundamentally evolved. A quiet, powerful closing moment does not rely on spectacle to make its impact. It draws its strength from everything that has already unfolded. By the time it arrives, the noise has settled, the immediate reactions have passed, and what remains is clarity. It is in this stillness that realization takes shape, not as something forced but as something unavoidable. The weight of prior actions, decisions, and consequences converges into a single point of understanding that does not need to be explained out loud. There is a shift in atmosphere that defines this moment. What was once chaotic becomes controlled. What was uncertain becomes clear. The absence of urgency allows space for reflection, and in that space, the full scope of what has happened can finally be seen. It is no longer about fragments of information or partial perspectives, it is about the complete picture, revealed without distraction. This clarity carries a different kind of intensity, one that is quieter but far more enduring than any immediate reaction. For those who experience this realization, the impact is internal. It does not demand outward expression, yet it changes perception in a lasting way. Understanding settles in gradually, connecting past actions to present outcomes with a precision that cannot be ignored. There is recognition, not just of what has been lost or gained, but of how it all came together. This recognition often carries a sense of inevitability, as if the result, once seen clearly, could only have unfolded in that way. The power of this moment also comes from restraint. There is no need for confrontation, no need to revisit what has already been decided through action. The outcome speaks on its own, leaving little room for denial or reinterpretation. Silence in this context is not emptiness, it is presence. It allows the realization to stand without interference, giving it the space to fully register. At the same time, this moment is not just an ending, it is a transition. The understanding it brings reshapes how everything that came before is viewed, and it influences what comes next. It closes one chapter not with noise but with certainty, leaving behind a sense that something significant has shifted, even if nothing more is said. What began as a single moment of quiet disrespect unfolded into something far greater, not through noise, not through confrontation, but through patience, precision, and understanding. Every step, from silence to observation, from strategy to execution, revealed a deeper truth about power. It is not always held by the loudest voice or the highest position, but by the one who sees clearly, waits deliberately, and acts with intent. The journey was never just about response, it was about transformation, about turning limitation into awareness, and awareness into control. In the end, what truly remains is not the fall itself, but the realization of how it happened, and the quiet certainty that nothing was ever as untouchable as it seemed. Thank you for staying with this story, for experiencing every layer of it, and for understanding the depth behind each moment. Wishing you strength, clarity, and the patience to always choose the right moment over the easy one. Good luck on your own journey, and may every challenge you face become a step towards something greater.